Grenada, Grenada, the black man, thank you. Grenadian teach me my greatest lesson. And who will learn from them, I am sorry. But listen to the lessons Grenadian teach me. Communism or socialism is the same gun head all of them on. And from the time you team up with them, like Grenada, you're straight on the losing end. My friend, got to stay away from them is all them is a misconfusion. You must have a nuclear weapon just to stay away from them is One is a with a gun telling you to vote. One saying to vote with a bomb at your throat. They're saving all their arms and ammo for me and selling the wheat for the enemy. Got to stay away from them is all them is just schism. From the time you team with one of them is the first thing they're talking about is protection. Double tax of people full your treasury. You got to maintain an efficient army. And too much pressure from the opposition. They will always rent you a whole battalion. And when you get the nexism out the way, how much life it costs you could never see. No way, got to stay away from them is all them is confusion. You must have a nuclear weapon just to hold on to yourself. Rescue mission to help Grenada. Rescue mission to Afghanistan. Rescue mission going the world over. No rescue mission to South Africa. Got to stay away from them is all them is just schism. Remember when Grenada had an ism that everybody say was mongoose oppression? The other ism just take up some gun and they had the old mongoose back on the run. 4 years later the thing turned back wrong. It's the same mongoose doctrine preaching in tongue. And Grenadians keep suffering evermore. All the taxpayers' money going for war and more war and more war. Got to stay away from them is all them is a misconfusion. You must have a nuclear weapon just to hold on to your Islam. Got to stay away from them is all them is a misconfusion. You must have a nuclear weapon just to hold on to your Islam. Rescue mission to help Grenada. Rescue mission to Afghanistan. Rescue mission going the world over. No rescue mission to South Africa. Got to stay away from them is all them is just schism. Guyana-Caribbean that everybody say was mongoose oppression. The other ism just take up some gun. And they had the old mongoose back on the run. 4 years later, the thing turned back wrong. It's the same mongoose doctrine preaching in tongue. And Grenadians keep suffering evermore. All the taxpayers' money going for war and more war and more war. Got to stay away from them is all them is a misconfusion. You must have a nuclear weapon just to hold on to your ism. They say how to keep forth from politics. Every year they boycotted Olympic. And while we arguing about who good and who bad, them going out in space and exploding flag. Got to stay away from them ism. All them ism is just schism. Johnny. The time is right now more than ever for man to sit down and write the new order. Where man would respect a man as a man and not through color and superior weapon. Where he must be equal, righteous and fair and realize that the earth is for all to share. Regardless of your color, class, or race. When them ism come, you keep off the peace. Why? But to stay away from them ism. All them ism is confusion. And Grenadians keep suffering evermore. All the taxpayers' money going for war and more war and more war. Got to stay away from them ism. All them ism is confusion. You must have a nuclear weapon just to hold on to your ism. They say how to keep forth from politics. Every year they boycotted Olympic. And while we arguing about who good and who bad, them going out in space and exploding flag. Got to stay away from them ism. All them ism is just schism. Johnny. The time is right now more than ever for man to sit down and write the new order. Where man would respect a man as a man and not through color and superior weapon. Where he must be equal, righteous and fair and realize that the earth is for all to share. Regardless of your color, class, or race. When them ism come, you keep off the peace. Why? But to stay away from them ism. All them ism is confusion. You must have a nuclear weapon just to hold on to your ism. One ism say come, one ism say go. One ism say yes, the next one say no. And while we keep fighting, there is a war. We people keep getting poor and more poor. But to stay away from them ism. All them ism is just schism. Love you, sir.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. Another Friday, another day in paradise, another day of struggle, another day to be alive. My man, Leroy Calise, Dr. Leroy Calise, the Black Stallion. Isms and schism. Welcome, all of you. Welcome down to Politics 101 on a Friday night. Welcome to Politics 101. Good evening. Good evening, Sister Denise Booker, Donna McDonald. Good evening, Esther Blue. Good evening, Aubrey Paul, my brother out there in Texas. Good evening. Good evening, Ori Newton, my brother in Buxton. All the Buxtonians on, good evening. Good evening to you all. I am eternally thankful to be a Buxtonian. Good evening to you. Good evening to all of you, wherever you're joining us from, whether it is in Europe. Good evening to all of you who are joining us from the United Kingdom, all my friends and comrades and villagers, fellow villagers out there. Good evening to the Skinners. Good evening to all of you. Norman Brown, good evening to you. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that after almost 4 decades, I ran into one of my classmates who is now living in England, Mrs. Skinner, Jean McPherson. And, I was talking about our times as children and the genius of that sister. Could have done anything in academia if she had chosen to. And I forgot to mention that she was a bishop's girl, and the bishop's posse on Politics 101 reminded me of that. Good evening to all the bishop's people. In my time when you're from the village and one of our own went to bishops or queens, that was a big deal. And Jean McPherson and went to bishops that year, and Brian Moses went to queens, I remember well. So I forgot to mention that. Good evening to you, Jean McPherson, if you're listening, and all our good people out there in the United Kingdom. Those of you who are joining us from France, good evening. And good evening to all of you. Yesterday, my sister Lynette Zephyr, my real sister Lynette Zephyr, out there in Brooklyn. Good evening to you. It's always a pleasure. You're a trooper. You're a trooper. And I always talk about Lynette. I mean, I've known Lynette since we were children, going to school at the same St. Anthony's RC School, Roman Church School in Buxton. And then later on, when we migrated, we got closer. And everybody knew that I was into politics. And the thing is that we hardly talked politics when we were together as friends. And I never knew Lynette, as we call her, or Imogene or Mogene, never knew Mogene was a political animal. We were friends. We never talked politics. And it's only over the last couple of years that I realized she's such a political animal. And it goes to show that, the experience of community, you take things for granted. Good evening, Lynette. Good evening, Omar David. Good evening, Yvette Graham, Jacqueline Argyle, all wonderful people, all Politics 101 troopers. Whether you're joining us from St. Martin, I know quite a few of us are there, from the Bahamas. Good evening. All of you are joining us from our Caribbean region. Our Caribbean region. I notice Marlon Newton is on. Good evening, my brother. Donna McDonald. Good evening, Simone Blackman. Good evening. Welcome to Politics 101. Normally we would have Dr. Vincent Adams on tonight, and I completely forgot it was Friday. And by the time I remember it was Friday, it was too late to get on to him. And so our apologies for not having Dr. Vincent Adams on. I spent most of the day watching cricket. The Super 50s on, the West Indies competition. And today Jamaica played Barbados. Barbados, of course, defeated Jamaica. And so I got lost in cricket, as we all do whenever we sit down to watch the game. And so time slipped away from me. Talking about cricket, when Dr. Vincent Adams was on the other day, and we were talking about Jean and her husband, Lonsdale Skinner. And Skinner, remember, coming back in the mid-1970s and becoming the wicket keeper and Guyana's wicket keeping in the days when we had real wicket keepers. And Skinner had come back, I think 1976 or thereabout, to 75. I think he played 2 or 3 seasons for Guyana. What we forgot is, I said on the program that Paidana for me is the best keeper that Guyana ever produced. And I suppose I made that assessment based on the fact that I saw more of Paidana than I saw of anybody else. During that time, it was Paidana, Bamfield, Stephen Bamfield, who was the other keeper in Guyana, didn't get much of a chance. But I remember on reflection that Lonsdale Skinner came back, and he played for 2 or 3 seasons, I think 3 seasons, 75, 76, 77. Paidana had been playing since 1971. And Skinner displaced Paidana in the team for those 3 seasons. And the argument can be made that Skinner was the better keeper. And Skinner never played after 1977. At that time when he came back, he was playing for Surrey in England. He was Surrey's first choice keeper. And I remember seeing him at border. Aubrey Paul, who we were Aubrey's on, and we used to go to cricket together. And we remember Skinner as a very neat and efficient keeper in the classical mode. He was in the classical mode. Wasn't a big showman, but he was in the classical mode. And he was a better batsman than Paidana, quite correct in his batsmanship. I think he batted as high as number 6 during those years to Guyana. And Paidana batted much lower down. But I got a note from Mr. Skinner, who was on, you see, the program that night. And I always wondered why he stopped playing or never came back to Guyana. And after going back and doing some research, I realized that he stopped playing after 1977. He was very young. I mean, not even in the prime of his career. He was 27 years or thereabout. And in doing the research, I realized he stopped playing because of racism. And you know that became a big thing in sports over the last couple of years. Michael Olden has a whole book on it. And there were commissions. There was a commission and in which cricketers testified, and Skinner spoke out about his career cutting short because of racism in England. Racism in England. And while we did not have racism in Guyana and the Caribbean in that sense, we did have our problems in terms of who played and who didn't play. And Skinner might have been a victim too of favoritism in Guyana. But certainly in England, Fred Titmuss, he named as one of the persons who personally was racially abusive to him. And I always threatened to do a podcast in cricket because there's so much to learn about our society in cricket. But Aubrey, you remember when we saw Skinner? No, I remember you was a Skinner. You was a Skinner man, Aubrey. Aubrey Paul is an interesting guy when it came to cricket. He would always back the underdog. Aubrey Paul, who's your favorite batsman? And he would tell you about Theodore Coffey from Trinidad. Not many people remember Theodore Coffey. He played for Trinidad a few years. Wasn't the best batsman. He was a regular in the team, but Aubrey had a way of always supporting the underdog. And Aubrey, I remember, was a Skinner man. Good evening to you, Mr. Skinner, if you're watching. And I learned also that Mr. Skinner is a Plaisance man. I didn't know that. The cricketer I remember from Plaisance was Rex Collymore, the left arm spinner during that time. But yes, on reflection, Skinner had to be as good as Paidan or even better because he displaced him. And as I said, while playing for Guyana in those years, he was playing for Surrey. I mean, you couldn't play for one of the county teams in those years if you were not good. Especially a team like Surrey. Surrey was very, very, very strong during that period. Good evening to you and welcome to Politics 101. Yesterday, October 19, was the 40th anniversary of the demise of the Grenadian Revolution. Hence my opening calypso tonight by Black Stallion, Isms and Schisms. Stalin reflecting on the Grenadian Revolution, the only armed revolution that took place in the English-speaking Caribbean, where the New Jewel movement, led by Maurice Bishop, overthrew the Eric Gairy government and created the Grenadian Revolution, which lasted for 4 years. For 4 years. And in 1983, in October, there was self-implosion, partly as one faction of the NJM, led by the deputy Bernard Cord, murdered the other faction led by Maurice Bishop. Maurice Bishop was murdered. The Americans seized the opportunity, invaded Grenada, and that was that. And when one speaks about the Grenadian Revolution, one has to bring to bear two perspectives, I think. One is that it was perhaps the hope, the only hope since our independence in the 1960s. The only hope for us in the English-speaking Caribbean of transforming our society in a fundamental way. In that what the Grenadian Revolution sought to do was to make a clean break with our colonial past and to chart a new way for our people. At the level of economics, at the level of politics. It was a time of hope for progressive politics in our region. I remember well, because our party, the WPA, was a sister party of the New Jewel movement. And at the time of the demise of the revolution, two of our members were there. And I remember one member, Dr. Rupnarayan, because the New Jewel movement requested of the WPA to send a representative to try to mediate between the two factions. And Dr. Rupnarayan went on behalf of the WPA. So we were very close political parties. I remember seeing Maurice Bishop coming to Guyana in 1976. He had come to represent Arnold Rampersad. Arnold Rampersad was a PPP member who was charged for murdering a soldier at the toll gate. And Maurice Bishop had come to represent him. And I remember Brother UC bringing him to Buxton. And so we were very close. And as I said, it was a time of hope, those 4 years. Those people almost wiped out illiteracy from Grenada in 4 years. In 4 years. They were the fastest growing economy during that period. And they didn't embrace a socialist economy. They embraced a mixed economy. But they faltered when it came to politics. They faltered when it came to politics. And they exposed a weakness that is still there in Caribbean politics. That within our political parties, we tend to be vicious against each other. Sometimes more vicious against each other in one party than we are vicious against the common enemy. I'm not throwing hints here, I'm just stating a fact. As a Caribbean people, at the level of politics, our political parties and political leaders have not learned how to deal with dissent. And that has led to all kinds of atrocities since independence. Look at our own government in Guyana and the way it is dealing with dissent. Of course, they didn't begin it, it was there. All governments in our Guyana and our Caribbean have failed miserably to deal with dissent. I remember when Lincoln Lewis and I were writing in the Chronicle, we were supporters of the coalition government, but we felt that we needed to turn the Chronicle into a better newspaper, meaning a newspaper that can support the government, but also carry in its pages critique of the government. And Lincoln and I decided that we were going to critique the government, although we supported the government. And I said on this program before, we were writing the editorials for the paper. And the editorials were very supportive of the government. But we were doing our own columns where from time to time we were critical of the government. So on a Sunday, I would write an editorial praising the government, but in my column being critical of the government. And I felt you couldn't beat that. But at the top level of the coalition government, they felt that all we should do is praise the government and not be critical of the government. And you all know the story. They kick us out of the Chronicle. We weren't opposition. We were supporters of the government. We in our Caribbean, our Guyana, have still not learned how to deal with dissent, especially dissent coming from inside. And as I said, sometimes we are more vicious against each other than we are vicious against the common enemy. And so the Grenadian Revolution faltered when it came to that. The court faction believed Bishop was not revolutionary enough. Bishop wanted to open up talks with the Americans because this was during the Cold War. The court faction felt that they should take a harder line. And instead of resolving the issue, one faction picked up guns against the other faction. They first put Maurice Bishop under house arrest. When the people freed him and they went up to Fort Rupert, the court faction sent the tanks up there, murdered Maurice Bishop and several of his comrades, and put an end to a glorious period in Caribbean history. To this day, Bishop's family do not know where his body is. The Americans have never turned over Bishop's body to his family because the Americans invaded Grenada after the shooting up. They wanted to do that in any case. And so they used the shooting up between the two factions to invade Grenada. And so Black Stallion, in that calypso, Black Stallion was very close to Maurice Bishop. They were good friends. And Stallion was one of those calypsonians that was singing about revolution then, and is still towards the end of his career. Well, he's now dead, died earlier this year. But throughout his career, he sang about revolution. So he was not against revolution, as many of us in the Caribbean were not. But Stalin is making the point there that when you are small, you need to keep out of certain fights. As he says, the isms, one ism versus another ism. And one of the things the Grenadian leaders did was they took sides. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1980, the Grenadian leaders, they took the side of the Soviet Union, going against the non-aligned ideology, the non-alignment. Remember, we had the non-aligned movement. If you go to that little park opposite the Bank of Guyana, we have the bust there of the founders of the non-aligned movement. Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Joseph Tito of Yugoslavia, Nasser of Egypt, and Nkrumah of Ghana. They created a path, what they call the non-aligned path, aligned neither with the Soviets nor with the Americans. It was a difficult time because in many cases you were forced to align. But at least the non-aligned movement offered a way out for us. And Stalin in that song is saying, it is the right approach, even today. Because he's saying if you have one ism, you better have a nuclear weapon to defend your ism. Grenada didn't have a nuclear weapon. And we are seeing today, it is those countries with nuclear weapons who are able to defend themselves against the isms. The Israelis have nuclear weapons. The Palestinians don't have. And we see the one-sidedness that's happening there. So Stalin is saying the lessons from the Grenadian Revolution is that we have to beware of isms. and that we have to be very careful of how we deal with internal dissent. We still haven't solved that in Guyana and the Caribbean. So we still have work to do in our country, in our region. Many of you are not happy with the opposition because we seem to be so divided. There is no all opposition front. I noticed the other day the AFC and the PNC came together at one press conference and spoke against the Venezuela incursions. And right away, Jack Dio got antsy because the PPP doesn't want to see unity on the opposition side. They don't. They don't. As soon as they saw the AFC and the PNC speaking with one voice, they start to shudder. Many of you, are concerned about what's happening inside of the PNC. The sniping sometimes that goes on. Now, in any political party or political movement, you are going to have differences. So that's not a problem. It's how you manage the difference. Good evening to all of you, Desiree. Good evening, Glenford Gordon. Good evening, Shondell Headley from my village. My cousin. She said, one of my daughters usually asks me, so the whole village is cousin? Because everybody's cousin. And yes, we are all cousins. Good evening, Shondell, as we would say, Della. Welcome to Politics 101. There are things that we have to continue to address because there are people who still do not accept that other groups in our society have a right to live peacefully. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. A couple of weeks ago, I made a call on this program for the state of Guyana to also give reparations to African Guyanese. That reparations, we should not only ask for reparations from the former slave masters, that the state of Guyana should also give reparations to African Guyanese. Because that state, this Guyana state, is the successor state to the slave and colonial state. And as Brother Kimani puts it, the state of Guyana, the present state, inherited both the assets and the liabilities of the former state. And so therefore, the state has a responsibility to right the wrongs of the state before. Now we know at the time of independence, the independent state guaranteed Amerindians lands and their right to land. And it was based on the fact that the Amerindians were the first people there. They were the first people. And they had an entitlement to land, to the land. The land is their ancestral land. And the new state, as they were gaining independence, Mr. Burnham agreed. And lands were granted to the Amerindians as an entitlement. Nobody disagreed with it. And successive governments have honored that agreement. But when I said that just as the independent state gave reparations by way of land to Amerindians, they should give reparations to Africans. Because while Africans were not the first there, Africans were the ones that was responsible for transforming the land into a habitable space, digging the canals for 200 years and more, working without pay, building the sea defense, the roads. And so my argument was that just as the Amerindians were given reparations via land, Africans should get reparations. And then some people on the other side who agree with reparations for Amerindians said they do not agree with my call for reparations for Africans from the current state. They said it's double dipping. We already gonna get reparations from the white people, and we shouldn't ask for reparations from the current state. I want us to listen to a clip, and then we will talk about it, because it gets to the heart of what I am trying to talk about here tonight.
But the point is, we don't see a distinction between the history of Indians when you compare, Indian history to the experience of others. Yes, we are brown people. We can be united on certain issues and so on. So this brings me to a couple of quick points I do want to make, and which is something that troubles me. We cannot make the argument when we talk about the current state. The current state of Guyana is not the same state as the state that exists prior to 1966. By the same token, we can't make an argument, it's going to be a difficult argument to make, that the revolutionary government of Cuba under Castro is the same state as the Batista state. By the same token, we can say that the revolutionaries who fought to create a new state in the United States are the same, it represents the same state prior to that. You can argue for reparations in the United States because it's the same state that exists after independence, right? Which enforced and established slavery in the United States. But when it comes to Guyana, my problem here is that if you're saying it is the same state, and this is the point I had made about something that David Hinds has said, you're double dipping because you're making an argument on the one hand that those who practice slavery, right, the plantocracy, the absentee owners and so on, have to provide reparations. We've seen that with the fifth generation Gladstone family who came to Guyana. But if you're saying, okay, that's fine, which all of us agree, and nobody disagrees with that, right? We all support reparation. But now you're saying that the current state of Guyana has to pay Africans reparation because their blood and their bones and flesh are buried, in those dungeons where those oil are being kept. Then you're now saying, well, it's the Amerindians, it's the Indians, and it's the other people in Guyana who are now being asked to pay reparations. So you're double dipping. And I stand by that argument that I made. It is not the same state. Um, and it's difficult to make that argument. The other thing I do want to make is I have read someplace a while back that the Native Americans who crossed the Bering Strait may have lived in Asia. So that probably means that they do have some a DNA that is connected to my ancestral people in India. If that's the case, maybe the three Amerindian tribes that Vincent talked about that may have come before Africa, maybe the other five have the DNA of my ancestors from India. So therefore, I can now make the argument that my ancestors were here long before many of the Amerindians, way before the Africans who came, right? So we came before Columbus, if you want to make that argument. My point in saying that is this, and it comes back to the question, and I want to be very blunt about this because we can't speak in a vacuum. Where does this end, right? The whole question of entitlement. Kimani talked about his personal experience. Well, my father was a very religious person. He would do his Lakshmi puja. Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth. He built a cottage. We lived there. He had 9 kids. Then he built a house, had 1 room, expanded that house. He bought some land, and that he was doing that while he worked at the estate, and he got hit by a punt that broke his hip, but he still continued. So my point is, we never complained. I've never heard him or anyone else complain about the fact that, well, it's the colonials, it's the British, who caused this high rate of suicide or alcoholism among Indians. They bear their shave, as we would say, and they continued. So my problem with this whole argument is that it comes back to this question again of entitlement, because I've heard it before. And what I have heard before is that, repeat what I said before, we came here before, we suffered more, we uplift Guyana 5,000 miles above the sea-coast. Africans lifted, 100 million tons of dirt. That's in the report that Nigel Hughes quoted, a brilliant lawyer. I wouldn't have him as a math teacher, but he's a brilliant lawyer. I don't know how they came up with that figure. But again, I'm not trying to make a mockery of this issue, right? I'm not trying to be flippant. But there are others in Guyana who have progressed. They have worked their butt off. And I talked about before the show about a person named Hari Prasad, who had so many obstacles in his way. He started out as a woodcutter. He used to sell in the market. He buy a ship, bought a second one. He began to transport wood. And then he eventually said, okay, the heck with this. I'm going to live in India. He took his 6 kids and his wife. He went to India. He lived there for a while, but then he came back. And then he built this town called Prasad Nagar with his own strength. To me, that is the strength of entrepreneurship. Nobody gave him a handout, right? There was no affirmative action to help him. He did this all on his own, and there are many Indians like that in Guyana. Now, we can make the argument that, well, Barnum did a lot of things. He crushed people. On the one hand, he allowed them to have the co-op, right? But on the other hand, he established an authoritarian system that took the power away from local people. So the question is, where do we go from there? And if we're using history as hindsight, we can't simply say that because of history. I mean, the Jews are saying that today, but they were the promised people. They built the temple, right? The Babylonians destroyed it. They built it again. Then the Romans came and destroyed it. Then they went all over Europe, and Hitler did his thing. And then they came back and says, look, this is, the Old Testament says, this is our land. We belong here, right? They can make that claim because they can defend it, right? They have the guns and whatever. So long story short, my point is this. I think we are trying to intellectualize this too much, especially when you have people like Eric Phillips talking about a certain percentage of land. In a country that is so big, you have less than 1 million people, and we have an oil wealth on top of our heads, and we are still, digging ourselves into battle, and we're arguing about land. So it's an important issue when it comes to learning about history, but when we use that historical knowledge or that history and try to make a claim on the state, a different state, mind you, that you owe me this. And at the same time, if that state is going to act on that demand, it means that you are now putting other people at a disadvantage who have sacrificed themselves over generations to be where they are today. And the question is, that one of the things that people are asking today in the United States, for instance, which we support, things like affirmative action and so on. If you don't have a lot of business people, okay, let's create programs to do that. But where and when does it end? And so far, I've asked these questions many times before, and nobody seems to have an answer for me. Right? You had 28 years of a government that established itself through institutions, through policies, and so on. But yet, we seem to forget that, and we now want to start from scratch and go back to the history book, right? So, I guess my point and my frustration with this, as you can tell, is that we seem to be using that piece of history, right, to put ourselves on the pedestal. Because I started out by saying we don't have a lot of Indians who could make these kinds of arguments, right? And maybe if we did, we can get to that point where we can say, look, there is that history, but there is something else about history which we can take and say, look, let's come up with a plan, right? A plan which can make things work. And that means we have to discuss a model.
All right. That is Dr. Betoram Ramarak. Dr. Betoram Ramarak. He's part of the Rafidev organization. And Vincent gave a brilliant response, which I'm going to play on the next program, because I want to take the rest of time that we have here to highlight for you all, because you've heard it there, what that fella is saying. First of all, he's saying that the state today is a different state from the colonial state. That is not true. That is absolutely not true. And I know that Dr. Ramarak knows the meaning of state as opposed to government. I know he knows because he's a professor. He knows the meaning of the state. But for convenience, in order to make a point, he's pretending he doesn't know what the meaning of state is. The colonial state and the present state that we have is the same state. We have made some modifications to the state since independence, but it is the same state. In the case of a place like Cuba, where you had a revolution and the Castros got rid of the old state and created a new socialist state, a brand new state. In the case of Guyana at the time of independence, we changed constitution, we now had a flag, we now had a national anthem. There were some modifications here and there, but the state remains the same. And what is the state? The state are a set of permanent institutions. The army, the police, for example, are what we call the coercive arm of the state. The army and the police today are no different from the army and the police during colonial time. The army and the police were shooting down black people during the colonial time. They're shooting down black people today. So the state has not changed. Yes, there were modifications. So when we talk about this state having responsibility. We're not talking about any new state. It's a successor state. But the relations, the social relations, the political relations of the state and the society during colonial time remain the same. There were modifications, yes. But I gave the example of the army and the police. The police was shooting down black and brown people during colonial times, and they're still doing it today. And the police represent what is called the coercive arm of the state. The police were putting shackles on people's feet when they went and were critical of the government. Just the other day, the police put shackles on Takumo Gonse's feet. What has changed? Ramarak knows that the state is the same state with some modifications, but he wants to make a point. And here's the point Ramarak is making. He's saying the only legitimacy that black people have as far as entitlement in Guyana has to do with slavery. That's when slavery was over. We didn't bear with chafe like Indian people did. We didn't have any Hari Prasad like the one he mentioned. That we were looking for handouts, unlike his daddy, who never complained, and he built a house. Black people always complaining. We didn't build houses for our children. And he's making the dangerous point that since independence, we African people have not contributed as much as other races. And so if we're asking the state for reparations, we're asking other races for reparations, because it's the other races that have contributed to the national patrimony, not us. Our contribution to the natural patrimony was during slavery, and we're going to get reparations from white people. But in the present dispensation, we have not contributed, and so we are not entitled. That's the point the gentleman is making. In order to make that point, he has to make a differentiation between the colonial state and the present state. He knows what the state is, but he wants to make that point that if you measure contributions to Guyana since independence, Indian people and perhaps other races have made more contributions. They didn't rely on history because they weren't in slavery. They rely on hard work. They never complain. They never get handouts. Black people, we have spent our time since independence complaining, getting handouts, and now we're asking the state, this new dispensation according to him, to which we have contributed less than others. That's the major point Dr. Ramarak is making. So we are double dipping. We're going to get from the slave masters, and he doesn't have a problem with that. But in terms of the present dispensation since independence, we are entitled to nothing. Let us take the argument that it was a new state. And let us measure our contribution. Where is the Indian contribution more than the African contribution since independence? That is the question that Ramarak has to answer, because that is his thesis. That is his thesis. His father worked on the sugar estate, and he never complained. He forgot that black people father work as policemen and women guarding the estate, guarding his father, protecting his father at night and day. He forgets that. Of course, to him, that has no value. Mr. Prashad, Bill Prashad Nagar, no handouts. I want him to tell us who the carpenters were that built the houses in Prashad Nagar, who digged the drains in Prashad Nagar, who paved the roads in Prashad Nagar. These guys are dangerous. You see, in one fell swoop, Eric Phillips, Nigel Hughes, David Hines. In their view, we are standing between them and total domination of Guyana. Betaram knows better. He knows that there is a successor state. He knows that nothing has changed fundamentally about the colonial state and the present state. But he wants to make that argument that if you take history from independence to the present, black people have not contributed much to Guyana. And so therefore, we have no particular entitlement. That is his argument. So you can stop our contribution at slavery in 1838, or you can stop our contribution at 1966, and you take only our contribution from 1966. That's how he's doing it. He's not saying that because of your work without payment before 1838, you then laid the basis for others who came who didn't have to work without pay. He's not saying that. He's not saying that. He's saying that from 1966, Indian people have contributed more than us. And so therefore we have no entitlement. We didn't bear with chafe. We complain about history. We complain about history, and we're using our history according to him to put us on a pedestal. Well, yes, Dr. Ramarak, take David, I'm telling you tonight. We are using our history to put us on a pedestal, yes. Not a pedestal that makes us superior to others, but one that makes us equal to others. Because slavery and colonialism took us off that pedestal that we were on in Africa. And the sons and daughters of Africa have a right to restore African people to the pedestal. I make no apologies for that, Dr. Ramarak. Absolutely none. That's what they sent me to school to do. And I'm going to do it whether you or others who ought to know better think I shouldn't do it. Guyana belongs to all of us. All of us. We Africans are not making a case of superiority. All all we're saying, pay us what you damn well owe us. That's all we're saying. And Indian people are also, pay them what you damn well owe them. You owe them for underpaid labor. You owe us for unpaid labor. Pay us. Pay us. All of us. But no. According to Dr. Ramarak, if the state pays reparations to Africans, then it's coming from Indians. What nonsense. The wealth that is coming from oil, does it belong less to Indians than Africans or more to Indians than Africans? No, it belongs equally to all of us. And when I am talking about reparations from the state, I'm not asking the state to give us money. I'm saying there are things that African people are dispossessed of because of our history. Begin by starting to teach African history in our schools. That's reparations. So that we can learn about ourselves. Our children can learn about their history. That's reparations. Indian people were able to buy lands cheap. We bought lands at inflated price after 1838. And the state has now seized those lands. Vincent will explain that those neighborhood councils that we have there, NDCs, the Falls Buxton NDC that has control of Buxton lands. The NDC is a state entity. And the state has now taken over the lands that belong to Buxton people. The state has dispossessed Buxtonians of their land, or Beefy people, or Moko people. And these were not lands that were given to us, it was lands that we bought. They're now owned by the state. And you're telling us that we don't have any entitlement from the state. Sisters and brothers, it is the point I've been making over and over. Our fight is not just to remove a government, although that must take front seat to remove the PPP so that we can create a democratic government in Guyana. That must be number one. But even when we do that, we still have to fight these other battles of people who believe that we are not entitled to anything in Guyana. All we are entitled to is what the white people take from us. The white people didn't carry the canals and the sea defense with them. We are only entitled to what white people owe. We don't entitled to what the state owes us. Indian comrades can talk about the my immigration fund, the money that was put there to send Indians back to India. And Mr. Burnham used it to build the cultural center. And they're asking the present government to restore that money to them. They can ask for that. They can ask for that. They can ask this government to repay them from that. But we can't ask the government to repay us for anything. So Dr. Ramarak is confusing state and government. He talks about 28 years. The 28 years of the PNC was the 28 years of a PNC government. And the other 28 years or 25 years of the PPP was of PPP government. but they were both governments under the same state. The PPP never dismantled the state when they took over from Burnham. Burnham Constitution was bad, they keep it. The Constitution is an instrument of the state. They keep it. They never transformed the state. The difference between the PNC and PPP is not the state, it's how they use the state. And look at the way in which this PPP government is using the state. Look at how it's using the police. Look at how it's using the army. Look at what it's doing with the Constitution. Look at how it's using the judiciary. Those are all institutions of the state. They are raping the state. And the state, as we said, in 1983, I was charged and taken before the court for damaging a tomato. In 1983, I was charged and taken before the courts for damaging a tomato. The magistrate chased the prosecutor out of the court. She said this is a slave law. But the law is still on our books. What has changed, Betoram? That law goes back to slavery when slaves were prohibited from damaging crops because the enslaved people used to damage the crops as a form of survival, or resistance, sorry. And they passed laws against it. And I was charged with one of those laws in 1983. Betoram knows better. He knows that this is the same state. And that the independent state, the post-independent state, has never corrected the wrongs that were done to African people. It has sought to correct some of the wrongs that were done to Amerindians, the taking of their lands. It has returned their land to them, some of their land to them. But the post-colonial state has taken lands from Africans. Yes, we don't have the same claim to the land as Amerindians. When Amerindians talk about ancestral lands, they talk about the original lands. When we talk about ancestral lands, we are talking about lands that we bought. Those are our ancestral lands. The ones that we bought, that our ancestors bought. So, you all see what we are up against and why we have to continue this fight and why we have to broaden this fight. We have to remove the PPP government in order to create a democratic form of governance. They are a hindrance to democratic governance. So we've got to remove them. So we have to fight that fight. But we also have to fight the fight for our survival in Guyana, our claim to Guyana. Because there is an intellectual stream of thought that would relegate us to third-class citizens in Guyana. When you are telling a group of citizens they have no entitlement, all citizens have an entitlement in any country. And you are telling us we Africans don't have an entitlement because we didn't bear his chief. But your daddy bear his chief. A punt injured him and he's still gone. Apparently when Africans were injured, they lie down home and stop work. We didn't bury chief. We didn't build houses for our children. We didn't create communities like Prashad Nagar. Never mind the village movement that we created and we maintain to this day. Oh no, we are not producers of anything of worth since slavery. I shall continue with this discussion because this is also the fight that we have to fight. And this is what people like Vincent Alexander, Nigel Hughes, and Eric Phillips, and the David Hines and others of our community are doing. We are putting whatever God-given talents we are lucky to have developed, we are putting it to the service of our people. And they don't like that. They would like us to behave like the other Phillips in the PPP. That's what they want us to do. But once we're not doing that, and we are fighting, as they say, to put black people back on the pedestal, because slavery took us down from that pedestal. And colonialism did. And they're trying to keep us down there. And yes, all groups use their history to lift themselves. History is his story. Our story. History is our story. If we can't use my story to put me back on the pedestal, what are we? Have a wonderful weekend, full of reflections, full of relaxation, but knowing that we still depend on. It is not going to stop until we can have mutual respect in our country. And that mutual respect must start by respecting the history of all our peoples, not relegating the history of one set of our people to some far off age. Let the white people take care of that. That the scars of bondage that African people face is not the responsibility of today's Guyana. That's what they're saying. I say otherwise. Kwaheri, I feel like some Swahili tonight. Kwaheri, good night. Good night, good night. I will come for say good night. Well, as we would say, as we leave the Kwekwe, night a come let we go where we go where. They are clean, oh. Come let we go where we go where, but we'll come back tomorrow. We shall be back.